Good evening. I'm Nicole Yanieri, Director of the ECU Language Academy, housed within the Office of Global Affairs at East Carolina University. I'd like to welcome you all to this evening's presentation entitled American Slavery, Freedom-Seeking, Resistance, and Resilience. As someone with nearly 20 years' experience in international education, I first conceptualized this project as a way to introduce international students to the history of American racism and why it persists to this day. However, international students are not the only ones who stand to benefit from this knowledge. Many of us, including those of us born and raised in the United States, remain ignorant of the important truths that have become obfuscated by the fabrications that white privilege has wrought over the course of hundreds of years. Let us then, in the spirit of inquiry, open-mindedness, and humility, turn our attention to tonight's program and the talents of Dr. Freddie Parker, Mary D. Williams, and Joanna Cirque-Smith. As a reminder, participants can use the Ask a Question feature for any question directed toward our panelists, while the chat function can be used for any other information or clarification request. This may be especially useful for those in the audience from the international community, including multilingual learners who may require further clarification of culturally specific or otherwise unfamiliar terms. Special thanks are due to East Carolina University's Office of Equity and Diversity, Office of Global Affairs, and the Ladonia Wright Cultural Center, as well as to UNC Chapel Hill's Carolina Public Humanities and Carolina K-12, without whose support tonight's program would not have been possible. Sincere thanks are also extended to our wonderful speakers, and of course, to all of you in attendance. I now turn the camera to Christy Norris, Director of UNC Chapel Hill's Carolina K-12, who will serve as tonight's moderator.
Thank you, Nicole, and I echo that welcome. I'm Christy Norris, Director of Carolina K-12 at UNC Chapel Hill's Carolina Public Humanities, and we are delighted to spend this next hour or so with each of you, from K-12 teachers to international students to community college and university faculty. We hope that everyone will leave with new information, new considerations, and the desire to learn more about the history of slavery in America. So before I introduce our panelists, I'd just like to ground us in some intentions. Nicole just mentioned three really important words as we enter in tonight's programming with inquiry, open-mindedness, and humility. And to layer into those words, I'd like to ground us in the wise words of W.E.B. Du Bois, who said, "Nations reel and stagger on their way. They make hideous mistakes. They commit frightful wrongs. They do great and beautiful things. And shall we not best guide humanity by telling the truth about all this, so far as the truth is ascertainable?" This past year has shown perhaps more than ever that our society holds a deep discomfort with facing hard history and an equal fondness with what many call historical myths. But understanding American slavery is vital, both in its centrality to the making of this country and to the lasting results in racial inequality today. And together, we have to face this history in order to begin fixing the inequities in our world today, not in the spirit of shaming or blaming, but in acknowledging and repairing and reconciling with our shared past. And slavery is hard. It is hard history. As Dr. Hasan Jeffries said, it is hard to comprehend the inhumanity that defined it. It's hard to discuss the violence that sustained it. It's hard to teach the ideology of white supremacy that justified it. And it's hard to learn about those who abided it. But likewise, hard history is not hopeless history. And for those of us who are teachers, we have to make sure we aren't teaching it as hopeless. We have to make sure that we aren't just teaching a past filled with victims, but rather resilient and strong survivors and fighters. We have to find the balance. North Carolina is absolutely rich with stories of resistance and resilience from freedom seekers who ran away and perhaps escaped via North Carolina's rich maritime underground railroad, to those who maintained and passed down cultural traditions and music and foodways, as we'll look at this evening, to those who refuted slave codes and Black codes and secretly learned to read and write. The story of slavery in North Carolina is not one-dimensional. And as Dr. Jeffries said, finding the promise and possibility within this history requires us to consider the lives of the enslaved on their own terms. Trapped in an unimaginable hell, enslaved people forged unbreakable bonds with one another. No one knew better the meaning and importance of family and community than the enslaved. And they fought back in the field and in the house, pushing back against enslavers in ways that ranged from feigned ignorance to flight to armed rebellion. There is no greater hope to be found in American history than in African Americans' resistance to slavery. And so it is with this spirit that we offer tonight's program, a program that acknowledges the central role slavery played in the foundation of this country, and that faces and owns up to the hard history, but also that spotlights the numerous ways enslaved people, through their own agency, fought to maintain their dignity, their identity, their culture, and fought for both overt and subtle forms of freedom as best they could. From choices as complex and dangerous as running away, to lifting themselves up and each other via song, to preserving and passing on foodways. Tonight, our expert panel will explore the myriad of ways enslaved people exhibited resistance, resilience, and fortitude. As David Blight said, the point is not to teach American history as a chronicle of shame and oppression, far from it. The point is to tell American history as a story of real human beings, of power, of vast economic and geographical expansion, of great achievements, as well as great dispossession, of human brutality and also human reform. Because yes, nations reel and stagger on their way, and they make mistakes, and they also do great and beautiful things. And we need to bravely face it all so that we can learn better and know better and do better. So with that, I would love to invite our three panelists on camera and get our program started this evening. Welcome, guys. It's so great to see you tonight. Thank you for being here. I hope you are all staying well, hanging in there, surviving the ongoing pandemic fatigue.
Yes, indeed.
Oh, good.
Good to see you, Christy.
Good to see you. It is always a pleasure. We appreciate you guys taking the time tonight. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce all three of our amazing panelists right now. And then we will get started with our first presentation. So in reverse order, I'm going to start with the amazing Mary D. Williams, who I'm just so excited because I have not seen her beautiful face, I feel like, in just months and months and months. And you give me such energy and spirit, and everybody tonight, you are going to leave with some energy and spirit too, believe me. But Mary is a performer and a scholar of the song and narrative of the Black South. She has performed in hundreds and hundreds of college, universities, schools, churches, libraries, public spaces all around North Carolina, all around the nation, internationally. She is just fancy, y'all. That's just all I know to say. She also intermittently teaches a recurring course with Dr. Tim Tyson, The South in Black and White. If that is ever offered in your area, you must take it. I took it many years ago, and it's an incredible course. And one of the things I love to make sure folks know about Mary, especially when we have K-12 teachers in the audience, which we do tonight, is she credits her very own teacher in middle school for putting her on the path to being the performer she is today. So, Mary, we are happy to have you here. Thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for having me. Thank you.
And next I'll invite Joanna Cirque Smith, who is the Associate Director for State Outreach at Carolina Public Humanities, where she helps facilitate publicly engaged scholarship around the state. Her research spans from food processing plants to foodways, and we are excited to have her here with us this evening to talk about how basically our stories can be told through our plates based on what's on our plates. So, you know, and also how foodways are even a form of cultural preservation and even resistance. Joanna, so great to have you here. Thanks for being here.
Having me.
And last, and who will start first, is Dr. Freddie Parker, who's Professor Emeritus of History at North Carolina Central University. He's the author of the books Running for Freedom, Slave Runaways in North Carolina, 1775 to 1840, and Stealing a Little Freedom, Advertisements for Slave Runaways in North Carolina, 1791 to 1840. I don't know how he finds time to do what he does. I could not list the number of historical commissions and boards he has served on, the teaching awards. You're going to see why he's won a ton of those in just a minute. You may even recognize him from PBS and BBC television specials. He's just all around an amazing scholar who, I said earlier, I refuse to let retire because I'm constantly begging him to do another program. But it is wonderful to have you here with us tonight, Dr. Parker.
Thank you, Christy. It is so good to be with you.
Awesome. So I've asked all three of these wonderful, wonderful people to start by just taking 10 to 15 minutes to basically give us a little mini lecture, so to speak. So they're going to offer some thoughts and some, you know, kind of opening ideas about the ways they feel enslaved people carved out their own freedom, be it literal, be it abstract, and how those enslaved resisted in all kinds of ways, whether subtle or overt. And so after that, we'll all have a conversation and basically talk about what you all, the audience, wanted to know, either from your questions in the pre-registration. And as Nicole mentioned earlier, you have the Q&A feature there if you want to ask questions throughout the program. But I'm going to say goodbye for just a minute to Joanna and to Mary, and also to myself. We're going to go off camera and we're going to let Dr. Freddie Parker be the star of the show for a little bit here and get us started. Thank you.
Thank you. Before I get started, Christy, you know, you're always applauding people. I just want to applaud you for what you do. And I especially want to applaud you for this beautiful introduction that you just gave us. Those quotes by Jeffries and by Du Bois are surely right on time. So we applaud you for all of the good things that you have been doing for many years with Carolina Public Humanities. I will start by reading some information to all of you out there. And I just want to say a good evening to all of you out there, and hope that you get something from these presenters tonight. You'll have to get something from us tonight. So I want to start by reading, and in the end, I want to share with you a few advertisements for runaway slaves that many of you have probably already have seen at some point. The topic of slave resistance in the United States has been at the center of the scholarly debate by historians for more than 100 years now. By the early 1920s, white scholars who wrote about slavery in the United States contended that, number one, slavery was the best thing that happened to Africans. It brought them out of the jungles of Africa into the New World and raised their level of civility. Two, they maintained that the enslaved loved their captivity. They loved their masters. And since they loved their masters and loved being in captivity, there was no room for resistance. Why would you resist a condition if it were pleasant and a chapel of ease? U.B. Phillips wrote one of the first scholarly books on slavery in 1918, a book entitled American Negro Slavery. He advanced this narrative, and a school of thought was born that dominated until the early 1960s. Scholars like Herbert Apteker and Kenneth Stamp, John Blassingame, Leslie Owens, George P. Rorick are but a few who advanced dramatically different interpretations of the early notions advanced by Phillips. In 1939, Apteker published American Negro Slave Revolts, where he showed that not only did enslaved Blacks conspire and commit outright overt acts of resistance, approximately 250 conspiracies and rebellions, they also committed other acts of resistance, including what he called day-to-day resistance, the form of resistance that gradually wore away or broke down the system of slavery. These were individual acts of resistance that included killings, burning of property, which was actually the most destructive and costly form of day-to-day resistance, destruction of crops in the fields, feigned illnesses, robbing the owners of their time in the fields, and work stoppages or strikes. Running away or flight from the environs of their enslavement was a costly form of resistance employed by the enslaved. Costly for the owners. It was an investment going down the tubes when slaves fled. There are thousands of cases where several slaves fled together from one plantation, leaving the owner to fend for himself for whatever period of time. And we know that owners spent handsomely to secure their runaway property. North Carolina, like the other southern states, required owners seeking their slaves to pay a reward to apprehenders. Additionally, at any given time after the 1780s, hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of human property could be found in the Great Dismal Swamp in northeastern North Carolina and southeastern Virginia. For those of you who are interested in the Great Dismal Swamp, Dr. Marcus Nevius recently published his book on the swamp, entitled City of Refuge, Slavery and Petite Marronage in the Great Dismal Swamp, 1763 to 1856. I'm proud to say that Dr. Nevius is a former student, and I actually directed his master's thesis on this topic. And I'm actually using the book this semester in my graduate class. Professor Daniel O. Sayers is the primary historical archaeologist. And after years of intense study in the Great Dismal Swamp, he concluded that runaway slaves performed a critique of a brutal capitalistic enslavement system, and they rejected it completely. They risked everything to live in a more just and equitable way. And they were successful for 10 generations, he says. One of them, a man named Charlie, was interviewed later in Canada. Charlie said that all labor was communal here. That's how it would have been in an African village. Sayers pointed out that a British traveler by the name of J.F.D. Smythe, writing in 1784, gleaned this description of runaways. Runaway Negroes have resided in these places for 12, 20, or 30 years and upwards, subsisting themselves in the swamp upon corn, hogs, and fowls. They have erected habitations and cleared small fields around them. Sayers also wrote that there were hardships and deprivations, without a doubt, but no overseer was going to whip the runaways in the swamp. No one was going to work them in a cotton field from sunup to sundown, or sell their spouses and children. They were free. They had emancipated themselves, living in the swamp. So what became of the Great Dismal Swamp Maroons who lived there for 10 generations. Sayers has evidence of a thriving community all the way down to the start of the Civil War. That's when they came out, he says. We found almost nothing after the Civil War. They probably worked themselves back into the society as free people. By the 1960s, scholars added to Professor Apteker's list of methods used to resist slavery. And they referred to this form of resistance as cultural resistance. That is the use of institutions like the family, religion, folklore, folk tales, riddles, jokes, songs, whistling, and other coping institutions and mechanisms they had at their disposal individually and collectively to survive the brutality of their enslavement. Professor Apteker wrote in 1939 that based on his study of world civilizations, people, no matter who they were, no matter what ethnic group, no matter what color, no matter what religion, when the hand of bestiality presented itself like it did in the enslavement of Blacks in the United States, people fought to shake off that hand of oppression and secure for themselves some semblance of freedom. They struggled to find physical and psychological freedom because this was natural. They saw the freedom of their captors being exhibited every day. There was always a free Black population, and the enslaved aspired to that condition. I've spent most of my career exploring the enslaved who ran away from their owners in North Carolina. In most cases, they fled alone. Though the Underground Railroad was an important institution for thousands of enslaved who made their way to the North, made their way to the territories, and even made their way to Canada. It is important that we examine the 170 years of legalized enslavement before the Underground Railroad came into existence. This is by no means an effort to diminish the importance, the significance of the Underground Railroad that was in place for about 35 years. A period, that is, those 170 years, when men, women, and children secured freedom for whatever period of time on their own terms without the aid of anyone in most cases. They left the farms and plantations between nightfall and daybreak in the face of bears and snakes and wild cats, and yes, slave catchers. And only a fraction were actually headed north. If they lived in Virginia, they were likely running away to a destination in Virginia. If the runaway lived in North Carolina, it is likely he or she was headed for a destination in North Carolina. And the same holds true for Alabama, Mississippi, South Carolina, and the other southern states, because they were in search of family who had been taken to another county in the state or another southern state. Earlier, I mentioned the importance of family as an institution in the lives of the enslaved. Heather Williams, who wrote the book in 2012, Help Me to Find My People, chronicles those men and women who placed advertisements in Black-owned newspapers after slavery ended, who were in search of family members. As late as 1920, 55 years after slavery ended, advertisements for family members separated during slavery appeared in the Chicago Defender, a Black-owned newspaper, and the Christian Recorder, the official newspaper of the African Methodist Episcopal Church. If you've never been unfree, If you've never been unfree, it may be difficult to understand what it is to enjoy a little freedom. Although the various methods employed by the enslaved did not always lead to their emancipation, a semblance of freedom, that is the secret meeting with your brothers and your sisters, petite marriage and grand marriage, a short visit to see loved ones, a lurking about the farm or plantation on which a family member lived, was freedom. Thank you. And at this point, I want to share my screen with you to look at a few advertisements for runaway slaves. The first newspaper was founded in North Carolina in 1751. And as early as 1751, you can find advertisements, usually on page 3, for the sale of Negroes, advertisements for the purchase of Negroes, and of course, advertisements for those who fled. This is an advertisement that was placed in the North Carolina Gazette in 1797. And the significance of these few lines is that they contain so much information about a human being. In many cases, we have the person's name. We have height, we have weight, we have so many pieces of information. Let me read for you. $10 reward. Run away from the subscriber about 4 months ago, a Negro man named Shade. He is an artful fellow, about 40 years of age. Had on when he went away a short blue jacket and trousers. He has lost 4 fingers off his right hand by the cut of an axe. I'm informed he is harbored or employed in Newbern, and it is very likely he may be found with one Jack Hamilton, with whom he is intimately acquainted. I will give the above reward with all other expenses to any person who will apprehend and deliver said fellow to me, or so secure him so that I get him again. The author of that advertisement, the owner of that enslaved person, of course, is Charles Smallwood. This is Washington, North Carolina, March 11. Number 2, a $10 reward here for 2 people who fled. Run away from the subscriber on the 15th of August last, a Negro man named Dick, about 35 years of age, low in stature, very black, both ears cropped, plays well on the fife, a Negro woman who has gone off with him named Rose, of a yellowish complexion, marked with the whip, the property of Mr. Thomas Gray of Halifax County. Her clothing mostly homespun. Whoever delivers said Negroes to the subscriber living on the road between Halifax and Tarboro, or secures them so that they may be had, shall receive the above reward with reasonable expenses. There may be some questions after this, but I want to point out a couple of things here. We see complexion. We see one person described as being very black, another person being described as being yellow. Something else important in this advertisement is the description that the individual's ears were both cropped. North Carolina passed a law in 1741 making it lawful for the state or the county to crop a slave's ear. It's specifically stated that when a slave committed an offense, they would be taken down to the pillory. A nail would be driven into the ear. They would have to stand there for 90 minutes, at which point the ear would be severed or cropped, or a portion of the ear would be cropped, and the nail would be pulled out, driven into the other ear, and the same thing would happen. We even have information about clothing that Rose wore. Ran away from the subscriber on the 19th instant, a Negro man called Jacob, About 30 years of age, slender and keen made, 5 feet 9 or 10 inches high. His color is a yellow brown and is very much marked with the smallpox. When he went away, he wore a coat and pantaloons of mixed homespun, likewise had pantaloons of yellow nankeen and cheeks and checks, and had a red pocketbook and some money. He is by trade a boot, shoe, harness, and cigar makes, likewise a barber. It is said he has a free pass, and it is on proof to conviction of his being harbored by any white man or free man of color, or $20 if secured in jail, and information given me at Wadesboro, North Carolina. Now, let me read this last one here. It's a little lengthy, but this is Women's History Month, and I want you to take a look at this woman. Runaway or was stolen from the subscriber on the night of the 8th instant, a bright mulatto woman and her child, a girl of about 4 years old. This woman ran away from the subscriber, executor of John Hunt, in the summer of 1808 and passed as a free woman by the name of Patsy Young until about the 1st of June last, when she was apprehended as a runaway. This advertisement appeared in 1824. Piety ran away in 1808. So for 16 years, she has been a free woman. On the 6th of the same month, I obtained possession of her in the town of Halifax, since which time, by an order of Franklin County Court, she and her child Eliza have been sold when the subscriber became the purchaser. She spent the greater part of the time she was a runaway, say 16 years, in the neighborhood of and the town of Halifax, 1 or 2 summers at Rock Landing, where I'm informed she cooked for the hands employed on the canal. She has also spent some of her time in Plymouth, her occupation while there are not known. At the above places, she has many acquaintances. She is a tall, spare woman, thin face and lips, long, sharp nose, and 4 teeth, somewhat decayed. She is an excellent seamstress, can make ladies' and gentlemen's dresses, is a good cook and weaver, and I'm informed is a good cake baker and beer brewer, and by which occupations she principally gained a living. Sometime during last summer, she married a free man of color named Ariel Johnson, who had been living in and about Plymouth and followed boating on the Roanoke. Since his marriage, he leased a farm of Mr. James Cotton of Scotland Neck, Halifax County, where he was living together with this woman. At the time, she was taken up as a runaway slave in last June. I have but little doubt that Johnson has contrived to seduce or steal her and child out of my possession and will attempt to get them out of the state and pass as free persons. Should this be the case, I will give $65 for his detection and conviction before the proper tribunal in any part of this state. I will give for the apprehension of the woman and child on their delivery to me, or so secured in jail or otherwise that I get them $35. Or I will give $25 for the woman alone and $10 for the child alone. The proper name of the woman is Piety, but she will no doubt change it as she did before. I forewarn all owners of boats, captains, and owners of vessels from taking on board their vessels or carrying away this woman and her child Eliza under the penalty of the law. Tremendous amount of information there about this woman who eluded captivity for 16 years. And when she was apprehended, 2 months later, she was able to flee again, probably with the aid of her free husband. I'll stop there, Christy, and we will now turn it over to Joanna Smith. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that illuminating and thought-provoking presentation, Dr. Parker. And there are a number of themes that you've raised that really resonate with the foodways that I'm about to discuss, especially the central importance of family. And thank you as well to all of our participants for being here with you tonight. It's a real honor to join you in conversation this evening. So I want to start out today by reflecting on one word, sustenance. We often use this word as a synonym for food, and I want to run with that because food sustained enslaved people through the hardships of slavery in more ways than just the physical. It sustained their connections to the past and to the cultures they carried with them. It sustained hope for the future and creative visions of what it might hold. And it also sustained a sense of pride, of community, and of selfhood in the face of the dehumanizing system of slavery. So let's dive in with a foundational question. What did food production look like during slavery? Much of the labor of slavery centered on food production. This was true on a small scale, with enslaved people farming and cooking for slaveholders' families and to feed themselves. And it was also true on a massive scale. And I'm thinking here of hog killings on plantations where enslaved people were made to kill and butcher hundreds of animals at a time, or of enslaved people in the Caribbean processing molasses in huge vats. But whatever scale it was taking place on, food production was rarely easy work, and it extended far beyond the kitchen. It included preparing fields, planting, farming, harvesting, foraging, hunting, fishing, raising and butchering animals, preserving meat, fruit, and vegetables. The list can really go on and on here. And yet, enslaved people were often not allowed to eat very much of the food that they themselves were producing. Instead, rations were handed out, usually cornmeal, lard, some meat, often tainted, some salted fish, perhaps some molasses, peas, greens, or flour. These rations were typically inadequate in both quantity and in quality. So here we have an image of an approximation of weekly rations at Monticello. So you can see there's a bucket of cornmeal, a few fish, and a little bit of fat back. On some plantations, central meals would be held for laborers in the field, and often enslaved people would eat with their families early in the morning or late at night. Harrison Beckett, who had been enslaved in Texas, when later interviewed, remembered it like this, quote, "My mother worked in the field. Sometimes she'd come in 9 or 10 at night. She'd be all wore out and it'd be dark and she was too tired to cook lots of times, but she had to get some food so we could eat. Us all around the table like that was a feast." And what you can hear in this is that even though cooking was an exhausting addition to the end of an already too long day, mealtimes offered valuable moments of family and community connection. And although slaveholders often tried to calibrate rations differently, feeding their more productive workers more food, I think they underestimated this very basic human impulse around food, which is to share, which is to care for one another. So enslaved folks got creative. They often supplemented the meat in their diet by fishing and hunting, sometimes with slaveholders' blessings and sometimes without it. In many places, enslaved people also planted their own gardens to grow food to supplement these rations. And in these gardens, although they were born of necessity, they became a place to grow familiar West African crops. African plants that were commonly found in slave gardens included watermelon, yams, okra, and black-eyed peas, which are all foods that I think many of us now associate with being at the very heart of Southern cuisine. And I want to stress that as we think about this, as we talk about enslaved people growing crops from their homelands, we're talking about a visceral connection to an African past through the smell of okra cooking or through the taste of fresh melon. Food has this capacity, smell and taste have this power to jump across time and space and to really transport us. Some of these foods were brought to the Americas by slavers who were using them to feed newly captured prisoners on ships. But some of them were also grown from seeds that were smuggled into the country by newly enslaved people in an act of defiant connection to the past, as well as an anticipation of the need to be resilient in the face of the unknown. And it speaks to the deep cultural importance of specific foods, that seeds would be one of the few precious objects smuggled onto a slave ship. Now here you can see a recreation of a slave garden. These gardens also often had healing herbs in them. Food can be medicine too. And enslaved people used this as an opportunity to pass along herbal and medicinal knowledge, as well as to literally tend one another's wounds. These gardens were also a place where the labor that typically went unrecognized and anonymous could be claimed and celebrated and even enjoyed. A number of narratives of ex-slaves reflect on how much individuality was planted into these gardens. In particular, people report that the boundaries of these gardens, like the fence that you see here, were used as an opportunity to plant rambling flowers or vines, making these gardens into sites not just of food production, but also of pleasure and pride and self-expression. It's telling that even after working 12 or 13 hours of forced labor, even after the sun had gone down, enslaved people were mustering the energy to go back to their own gardens and work there in order to help feed their own families and friends. Food historian Michael Twitty says in one of his talks about African-American foodways, quote, "Feeding people is a spiritual exercise." And that seems especially true when it's taking place under extreme duress. Slaves' diets have actually been a very contested facet of the history of American slavery. And this is in part because defensive slaveholders often sought to justify slavery by arguing that they were feeding everyone on their plantations very well. We simply have too much evidence to the contrary to think that this is really what slavery looked like in most places. For example, from the era of slavery, we get the phrase, quote, "living high on the hog," as in, masters lived high on the hog, eating hams, these cuts that are considered the nicest part of the pig, while enslaved people were given the lower parts, the organ meat, the neck bones, the ham hocks, the feet, the tail, the intestines. And these ingredients might be familiar to many of you today through soul food, from ham hocks and collards, as pictured right here, to things like fried chitlins. And there are some African-American communities today who have rejected this kind of food because of its associations with the deprivations of slavery. But others consider it to reflect not only a legacy of resilience, but also a legacy of African culinary and even spiritual traditions. The traditions that enslaved people were drawing on were ones that valued reverence for animal life. Eating the whole animal was a form of resourcefulness, but also a way of showing gratitude. And so in this way, we can see that as food traditions were developed and passed down, cultural and religious values were also being articulated. For a long time, enslaved people were talked about in histories of the development of American cuisine as just workers, as essentially machines carrying out white instructions in the kitchen. And of course, this could not be further from the truth. The kind of agricultural and culinary knowledge that enslaved people brought with them from Africa not only served as a source of resilience within their own communities, but also truly shaped America's culinary future. A great example of this is in South Carolina's Low Country. Plantation owners there had been struggling to find crops that worked well along the marshy, wet coastline. But when enslaved people began arriving from coastal Africa, they brought with them the knowledge of how to grow rice, which quickly became the go-to crop for this region. Growing rice involves damming tidal marshes and cutting freshwater irrigation ditches while guarding against saltwater, setting up floodgates to be very precisely timed. This is not simple work. Women played a key role in passing on this knowledge, both as planters, who used a very specific heel-toe movement of their feet to bury rice seeds in the same way that they had back in Africa, and also as weavers who could make the fanner baskets like the one pictured here, which would be used to winnow rice by throwing it up into the air and letting the wind blow the husks away. These agricultural technologies had been painstakingly developed over centuries in West Africa, and they came to shape the economy, the landscape, and the cuisine of the American South. Just think of how much Southern food involves rice. But the powerful impact of African American foodways on America at large was not just about passing on technical knowledge. It was also about creative innovation. Enslaved people were doing much of America's cooking for about 200 years. In fact, in early America, many of the most highly trained and highly coveted chefs, including 2 presidential cooks who we might think of as America's first celebrity chefs, were themselves enslaved. So who was developing new cooking techniques? Who was experimenting with new combinations? Enslaved people. And the cuisines that they developed out of this were not replications of African foodways, and nor were they replications of European cooking styles, but rather they showed a creative new approach, one that drew on African traditions while embracing the realities of a new context and the opportunities that came with new cultural encounters. So for example, enslaved people developed Southern traditions of barbecue out of these cultural combinations. They drew on African spices, traditions of animal sacrifice and communal celebratory meals, but used typically pigs, which was a European animal. In Creole cooking, we can see the same kind of fusion in action. There we see African ingredients like okra being prepared drawing on French cooking techniques. So these kinds of combinations go to show the ways in which the creative expression, the creative vision of enslaved men and women really created American cuisine. So in the interest of time, I'm going to wrap up here, but I want to leave you with just one more quote from historian Michael Twitty. He writes, "Food is how we passed on our culture. Food is how we resisted enslavement and oppression. And food is how we showed our agency." And this really sums up what a powerful tool of resilience food was under slavery, and what a profound legacy African American foodways carry with them today. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Ms. Williams for her presentation.
Lord, why come me here? Lord, why come me here? Lord, why come me here? I wish I never was born. They took my children away, Lord. They took my children away, Lord. They took my children away, Lord. I wish I never was born, Lord. Why come me here? Thank you, ECU, as well as Christy and everyone that's a part of this evening. I appreciate this opportunity to share the music that is so endearing to me, but that actually was such a tremendous part of the slave narrative. One of the things I do want to start with is that Dr. Parker, I do agree with everything that's been said and how powerful it is to understand how that the enslaved, as they built their narrative, how collective and unified they were in doing so. You all were asked to read also the writings in the preface, Teaching Hard History, and that it is not hopeless. While it is complex and difficult, they meaning the slaves, through their own agency, fought to maintain their dignity and their identity and their culture. And tonight, I want to start with just that, their culture, how important it was. In my scholarship, introducing music is so powerful because it is a staple that started with slavery in terms of the spirituals and then was actually transmitted throughout time orally. The beautiful thing about it was that these songs that I'll share with you tonight actually were used and passed on all the way through and up to the civil rights movement, and even in some aspects of today. These songs are sacred. They are sometimes haunting. They are sometimes, they're songs of a tradition, and they are used in a way to combat many of the issues that confronted many of the enslaved. The spirituals were used to pass messages. They were to tell stories. And these stories were stories that literally that had been heard, not that they had read, because from 1740 to 1834, anti-literacy laws, and there's an amendment to the 1739 Negro Act. Between 1740 and 1834, North Carolina, South Carolina, Virginia, and many other states passed this anti-literacy law. And in the South particularly, prohibiting the teaching of a slave to read or to write, punishable by a fine of 100 pounds or 6 months in prison, via this amendment to the 739 Negro Act. The spirituals with their lyrics made great mentoring. It was a text that actually was communicating so many things as those that were engaged or involved in plantation work. They used them as an instrument, as a weapon, as a tool. And this was their way of demonstrating character. This demonstrated their visualization, what they were visualizing in terms of words that they could not even put to song. They could not even say the word freedom, but yet they used symbolic words when they were singing songs like, I'm on my way to Canaan land. I'm on my way to Canaan land. I'm on my way to Canaan land. I'm on my way, great God, to Canaan land. As that song was passed on orally, Canaan represented several portals. It represented the portal of geographically moving north, geographically moving to Canada, or through the portal of death. But either way, Canaan represented freedom. And of course, during the civil rights movement, they literally changed Canaan land, that particular part of the lyric, they changed it to freedom land. But this is what the enslaved inferred. This is what they envisioned. They envisioned freedom. Hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh, hush, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh, hush, somebody's calling my name. Oh, my Lord, oh, my Lord, what shall I do? This song is anticipatory. This summons for God, for Christ to come. Whoever soever will respond to me, because it's this triangular relationship that's going on. You've got the slave owner, you have the enslaved, and then you have God. But they're calling for this inward or physical liberation, seeking for it, and then passing messages that were an instrument used as a tool to even pass on information. I tell my students often when I'm teaching the material that it is so important to understand that these songs passed to plantations faster than text messages, believe it or not. Spirituals swing from individual to collective choral technique. They are either vice versa. They're specifically recognized as call and response. Individuals representing this group, this body, this specific community of people, the enslaved, and this singer, as they join in, begins to recognize that as an individual, that this collective moment is happening and this opposition that needs to take place. And the song becomes that type of covering, that type of shield. They find the solace that is almost, you can't hardly understand it, but they find a solace there. Still away, still away, still away home. I ain't got long to stay here, my Lord. He calls me by the thunder, the trumpet sounds within my soul. I ain't got long to stay here. This identity to culture, this identity to dignity, to identify that, yes, I ain't got long to stay here. Songs that they were able to create improvisationally after hearing stories, not being able to read them, but to hear them. Did my Lord deliver Daniel? Deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel. Did my Lord deliver Daniel? And why not every man? He delivered Daniel from the lion's den and Jonah from the belly of whale. The Hebrew boys from the fiery furnace. Why not every man? Did my Lord deliver Daniel? Deliver Daniel, deliver Daniel. Go down, Moses, way down in Egypt land. Tell all Pharaohs to let my people go. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you mourn. Oh, Mary, don't you weep, don't you mourn. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. Listen now. One of these mornings bright and fair, I'm gonna spread my wings and cleave to the air. Pharaoh's army got drowned. Oh, Mary, don't you weep. These songs were songs of revenge. Who was Pharaoh? Who got drowned? Who did they represent? The plantation owner. These songs were a way of building this quilt metaphorically with everyone that participated, bringing something to the table, making their experience a contribution to whatever was being shared, whatever song was being shared, but yet and still they were projecting visions of freedom. It reinforces, it strengthens, it gives beauty, and it is useful. This cohesion that was developed just through song, this solitary ability to bring this into a collective, unified opportunity to share, but also can actually talk about the slave master right in the presence of the slave master. I got shoes, you got shoes, all God's children got shoes. When we get to heaven, gonna put on our shoes, we're gonna walk all over heaven, heaven, heaven. Well, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. They will line up in the churches by the invite of their slave master. And they will call the little happy darkies across to sing this during the church service. But they would sing, I got a robe, you got a robe, all God's children got a robe. When we get to heaven, gonna put on our robe, we're gonna strut all over God's heaven, heaven, heaven. Well, everybody talking about heaven ain't going there. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, coming for to carry me home. Swing low, sweet chariot, a lullaby, coming forward to carry me home. I looked over Jordan, tell me what did I see? Coming for to carry me home, a band of angels coming after me, coming for to carry me home. In closing, and you all may have heard my alarm go off, but these were songs of mourning, songs of promise, songs about the slave master, songs of freedom, songs that were improvisational, and were created while the enslaved worked in the field, while they may be nursing the actual slave master's children, while they longed to see their loved one. Songs with unknown composers. James H. Cone states in his book, The Spirituals and the Blues, song is essential for identity and survival. Spirituals invite the audience to experience endurance. This may be my last time. This may be my last time, children. This may be my last time. Oh, maybe my last time. I don't know. Maybe my last time. I don't know. It may be my last time. I just don't know. Now it's back to you, Christy.
Hey, thank you, Mary. I'm going to invite Joanna and Freddie to come back on also so that we can start to have a little bit of a chat. I don't know where that comes from, but was everybody else kind of like dancing and singing in your living room and in your house? Yeah, for sure. We all needed that, Mary. Thank you so much. So I just want to spend the rest of our time here kind of posing some of the questions. We have some great questions from our participants. And one of the first things I want to start about that several of you have already addressed, especially you, Dr. Parker, is the misconceptions that we have about American slavery. So, Dr. Parker, you talked about this, myth that was pushed that enslaved people loved their masters or that they were docile and happy. Just so many misconceptions have kind of grown over the years. And so I'm curious to know from you guys, what do you think are some of the biggest misconceptions, especially you, Freddie and Mary, since you teach undergraduate students. I'm curious to hear what are some of the common misconceptions those students are coming to you with, and also what are some of the most important things that we need to consider to kind of reframe our thinking about American slavery?
Well, I'll start. One of the things I find is that there is a misconception, and that it was, and ironically enough, I find this interesting because I'm always shocked, even when adults, not just undergraduates, are studying in this academic setting. But I can remember Dr. Tyson and I were presenting somewhere, and an elderly gentleman came up to me, and he was actually talking to Tim, but of course I'm standing right beside him. And so he looks at Tim, and they're having this conversation. And then all of a sudden he just says, well, I mean, at least they got here. He said, in other words, he was trying to say that, slavery was the only way that an African could get here. And so he was saying, at least, they got here. And I'm thinking, I'm Black, and I'm standing right here, and and so Tim, I think Tim was kind of at a loss for momentarily, but the thing of it is that there are misconceptions that someone could enjoy being valued as property, and where the stigma of being docile and even this whole thing of minstrelsy that continues today. It is this misconception, and I think that it comes from the fact that a lot of times, which is wonderful, the work that you do, Christy, to allow teachers to have an education in terms of how to teach the material, rather than making assumptions about material, or unfortunately pulling from memory what grandma may have said. When we were taught. You think about, I'm sorry, what?
Or what we were taught. In many ways, we ourselves have gone through an education system that, didn't necessarily teach us right. So I completely agree with you. Yeah. I think
so you're right. What we do is try to dissolve those by, books like Dr. Parker has written, books that have been written that are true history. And the beautiful thing about the history can be traced. And then it is so, as far as geographically, it is, set most of the time where they were raised in North Carolina. I love the fact that we share those kinds of books in our course, because students need to understand what happened where they lived.
Right.
No matter how often they may say, well, my mom never told me this, and some older students may say, I don't remember this.
Right.
So I think it's a way of dissolving these myths. Yes. And truth is what does that in history.
And you're getting too at primary sources, which are so important for teaching slavery, not necessarily images or drawings of enslaved people being beaten. But for instance, one of the things I posted when Dr. Parker was presenting are the runaway slave ads. UNCG has a collection where you can search those ads by county. So for a student to look at ads from their very county, that then becomes history you can touch. I think that's really powerful. The other thing you said that I think is really powerful, in thinking, even, it was a dumb old man who said it to you. People don't understand the richness of the lives and the cultures that folks were pulled from. There was such a rich civilization, such diversity and richness in Africa. For all the teachers joining us, and frankly, for anybody, if you have children or just want to read a great book, Copper Sun by Sharon Draper is a young adult novel that starts with a little 14-year-old girl just living her normal life as an Ashanti, and she's crushing on a boy, and her little brother's getting on her nerves, and then she is ripped out of that and put into the Middle Passage. And it's a really powerful book, one, to show the richness of the culture they were pulled from, and two, to really show the humanity and remind us of the individual lives. I think it's, if you haven't read it, I recommend it to everybody. What about you, Dr. Parker? What would you add to that in terms of common misconceptions and what we need to be careful about?
I think Sister Williams is right on point. I mean, I would echo what she said and add that from the time slavery ended in 1865, our educational system decided to go down a track of writing a narrative in the way that they have written it. And the sad part about all of that is that to a great extent, it continues right down to the present time. You know, I remember being in high school in 1968 and 69, and when people were burning books, they were burning Soul on Ice, they were burning the autobiography of Malcolm X, they were burning Man, Child in the Promised Land by Claude Brown. But our educational system is key to all of this. It absolutely, I mean, what you have been doing, Christy, for the last, how many years you've been doing that? 20, 15, 12, 15 years. I mean, it's key. I mean, the bottom line, what you're doing is absolutely the key. Many of you may know that back on February 5th, the Department of Public Instruction, Board of Education, approved this new way of looking at American history. And it's sad to have been fighting with the Department of Public Instruction in the state for the last 10, 12 years, arguing about the teaching of American history. At one time, an effort not to teach American history before 1877. That was on the table at one point. The idea is to put everything into one one bag and only teach it since 1877, which means you don't even talk about the institution of slavery had they gotten their way. So it's all about the way it was structured in 1866, 1868. Efforts, I don't know how many people actually know that when the Civil Rights Bill of 1875 was passed, it was one of the most beautiful, comprehensive bills that one could ever come up with, because it included the education of the former slaves. But when you read the Civil Rights Bill of 1875, you will see that it's not there. In order for it to pass, they had to pull out the section on education, which would have actually brought about a desegregated education where Blacks and whites would have been going to school together. And there were efforts by Charles Sumner to say, let's teach the right thing. But as early as the 1860s, 1870s, and thereafter, there has been a conscious effort to tell a lie. That's the bottom line. There's no other way to really look at it. And the sad part about that whole thing is that as late as 2021, to hear the Lieutenant Governor of the state of North Carolina say that we don't need to use the phrase systemic racism, that we should not use terms like gender-based, that we should not concentrate on teaching women's history because it might make men mad. You know, God. And all of that translates for me, you know, it's amazing. It translates into who you send to Raleigh, who you send to Washington, who you send to, it's all about the selection process, the voting.
Right.
I mean, we change things. It's not a perfect system, but you can change some things based on who you send. Everything that we do is based to some extent on somebody in Raleigh or Washington, in our case, or in your little town council or your county commissioners. You know, they make decisions about us. So you should have some say so about who goes there to make those decisions. And people have made some ugly stuff.
We need more teachers in office. We have community colleges and K-12 and universities in the crowd tonight. We need more teachers.
We do.
City councils and county commissioners. We need folks in office who understand the inner workings of this.
That's right.
You know, it's interesting. I was just thinking, I'm not a math person, but you know, we like the numbers. But I think another misconception is this idea that slavery was long ago and far away.
Right.
And when you actually do the math, you know, if you go with the year 1619, and I know some scholars debate that back and forth, but let's just go with it for this equation, 1619 to 1865, that's 250 years, right? So of this, but you know, so it's only been 156 years since we haven't had slavery. And if you know the history, you know that for at least 100 years after 1865, we had legalized discrimination in different forms. And so we're talking about the history of slavery in this country is much longer and deeper than the freedoms for Black folks. And so I think that's something that we really have to push home and understand. It wasn't long ago and far away. It's still right here with us today.
Yeah, my great-grandfather, was born in 1851. And when I hear stories about him, it seems like it was just yesterday. I'm just 3 generations removed from him.
Right.
Born in 1851 and became free in 1865. So my father knew his grandfather.
Right.
He talked to him. So my grandfather, of course, died in 1955. So he was with him until he died in 1920. My great-grandfather died in 1929. So, I hear these stories. So it seems very, very close. And being a historian is even closer.
Right.
So,
that's right.
Yeah. Well, one of the things too that I talk about, Christy, you've heard me talk about my grandmother being in Smithfield, living in Smithfield, North Carolina, where, the billboards as a little girl going into Smithfield with her to go shopping when my parents let me stay in the weekends and seeing the billboard, welcome to KKK country. Yeah. What I often tell my students, and this is something that in teaching our course that we often really reinforce, there's a residue.
Yes.
There's a lingering residue, and it is still there.
That's right.
And what we're doing is, what is I think it's Bernice Johnson Reagan that tells you when you forgot, when you've forgotten where you come from, go back to where you can remember, where you came from and start there. Yeah. So the thing of it is that, students need to understand, about really how we got to where we are, and then why the conversations are the conversations that have been had. You can trace these different things. You can trace them back in time.
That's right.
And so when we see that these things are not being replicated, then maybe we can change direction. But I just don't think we can, because you have to understand, I need for, I have 3 sons, 2 grandsons. I need for them to know, I need for them to know exactly how that they were able to all 3 get a college education. But I needed for them to understand what my grandfather went through just because of Jim Crow laws, just because of the fact that he lived in Smithfield, just because there was a Klan sign there, because he could not even then face a white man look him in the eye and speak. He had to bow his head and walk on the sidewalk. I need for them to know that the name, the legacy that they carry, what that legacy meant, it's very valuable.
That's right.
And I think other cultures need to understand that. And I think when they do, I think you're the host, when she came on at the beginning, I think that what she's saying, she's hitting the nail on the head. Until other cultures that come into our area understand what's going on, they'll understand why some of the things are happening to them that come in from different backgrounds. They'll understand it. As my grandma said, they'll understand it better by and by.
Yeah, all of us for that matter, right? It's so interesting. Yes. I just ran across this quote from Nicole Hannah-Jones. She said, "So much about the America we live in right now can be traced directly back to slavery, if we'll just open our eyes to it. If you look across modern American life, so much of our institutions, our politics, our culture can be traced back to slavery. We need to bring that story from the margins and make it central to our understanding. And until we can't fix it until we face it."
That's right.
And so, more on this kind of concept of misconception, again, Freddie, you kind of talked about this a little bit, but we have several questions about this. I think a lot of students, and, when I say students, really
all of us.
It's all of us, right? We kind of get that Gone with the Wind picture, the big plantation, the enslaved people in the fields. But the history, especially in North Carolina, but all around the South, is much more complex than that. You know, I was recently reading part of David Silsesky's The Waterman Song, Slavery and Freedom in Maritime North Carolina. And he talks about this maritime underground that existed in North Carolina because of our rivers and the sounds and the connection to the ocean. You had this rich culture of enslaved and free Blacks really as skilled boatmen and cooks and, you know, just kind of able to operate outside of the eyes of slave owners because of the nature of nautical work. But when we think about slavery, that's not what pops into our head. And so what would you say, what are some of those other pictures we need to lay over? Yes, there were plantations, although that wasn't a huge thing in North Carolina. What are some of the other images we should lay over that? You know, Joanna, you pictured some of that, you know, this idea of food and the, you know, passing down of culture through food. What are some of those other things that we need to breathe into this kind of misconception, the imagery that we have?
Go ahead, Joanna. You asking Joanna?
Well, I mean, I know I did touch on this a bit, but just to kind of echo what I've already said here, I think there is often an unspoken assumption that scarcity diminishes humanity, that scarcity kills creativity, or, you know, diminishes your energy to want to care for your family and friends. You get into just a survival mode. And that's not accurate. I don't think that's how humans work. And that's certainly not how the enslaved live their lives. And so, you know, one thing that I think is just important across the board is to try to take what we've been handed, these flat narratives of the lives of the enslaved, and to try to bring them to life and to acknowledge the agency that is in those stories. So when thinking about what slaves ate, instead of just saying, well, here were their rations and here were their gardens, instead trying to think about, you know, if you're a mother and you're trying to celebrate your child's birthday, or there's a holiday that you want to make special and you have very limited ingredients, how are you still going to pull this together in a way that creates these vivid memories and traditions for your family? And I think that, you know, just a more empathetic connection with this past can help us to get away from the really persistent dehumanizing tropes of the narratives around slavery that we've been handed.
Yeah, that word empathy, and I think in all history education, that is so critical, the word empathy. Is there anything that, Freddie, you would add to that?
I think in our quest to find that which was typical in the slaveocracy, we miss out on understanding slavery in all of its dimensions. And that's what we have done. You know, one of the best articles that I think I've ever read on slavery in North Carolina was one written back in 1962. It was called Slavery in Microcosm, Burke County, North Carolina. Burke County, North Carolina, in the western part of the state. A friend of mine wrote an article entitled Slavery in Microcosm, Onslow County, North Carolina. And the message here is that just because it happened over there in that county doesn't necessarily mean that it happened over here in this county. Slavery was very, very complex. That's right. You know, and we always try to find that which was typical. But when you do that, you really miss out. I understand now that the sources may not be there to help us find slavery in microcosm. But one of the things that began happening in the early 1980s was this comparative analysis. Comparative in that historians were comparing slavery in North Carolina to slavery in Cuba, to slavery in Mexico, to slavery in Brazil, to slavery here and slavery there. you'll find out that there are many similarities, but of course there are many, many, many differences. And then by the 1990s, you're having these studies on slavery in microcosm. I mean, I had a student who did a wonderful study just on Pitt County, North Carolina. For a master's thesis on Pitt County, North Carolina, believe me, slavery in Pitt County, North Carolina was a bit different than slavery in Orange County.
Right.
So, to look at it in all of its dimensions is what we continue to try to do. And so when we have these master's students, we encourage them to go out and dig in the archives, because what may have happened even in the northern part of Orange County is different than what happened in the southern part of Orange County. The temperature variation in northern and southern Orange County. We all know that the further north you go, if you go to Roxbury, you're going to get some snow and some ice when you might not get anything.
They have power and I don't. Why? Right.
So I think to really understand and to get away from these misconceptions, we just have to continue to do more and more of the very important research that's needed.
Right. And there are such amazing stories in this state of freedom seekers too. You saw some of those images if you were here for the opening slides, but we've got people like Abraham Galloway, who I feel like was like the Black James Bond of, the 1800s. There is no cooler story than Abraham Galloway, or Elizabeth Keckley, who goes from enslaved to seamstress to the stars,
Yes.
Moses Roper, and all of these just incredible, Moses Grandy, these incredible stories from, some of them have narratives, there are primary sources that tell these stories of these individual people who, against all odds, fought for their freedom. So that misconception of freedom was something granted by the Emancipation Proclamation and the shackles fell off and everybody walked off the plantation happy. That's not at all how it was. And also so many people kind of, as Freddie, I love how you say, stole their freedom themselves. That's a really important thing to push. I want to ask you guys, Linda is asking such a great question. I know we're coming up on time here, but I have to keep you for a few more questions here. She's asking a great question that gets at the broad topic of gender and enslavement, the role of women in particular in enslavement. And she's asking specifically, and Freddie, I've heard you talk about this before a little bit, about how challenging would it have been for enslaved women to escape with young children? What was the kind of, have you done percentages in terms of men who ran versus women who ran? Because you would think motherhood might impact that. And also it makes me wonder about the role of women in foodways, in the passing down of music, kind of just holding on to those cultural institutions. So starting with you, Freddie, can you talk a little bit about the likelihood of, or less likelihood of, mothers making the choice?
We know that in all of the studies on runaway slaves, in my study, 82% of the 3,000 people who fled were men. 18% were female. We know that that 18% actually carried well over 100 children with them when they fled. Of all the children who fled, this is amazing. Of all the children who fled, a female was involved, be it with an entire family or an entire family and others. Females were always involved. And I have actually parceled out, I've done this article that I'm actually going to send for publication, Female Runaways in North Carolina. So it's something that we might want to do at some time, Christy, a whole thing on female resistance.
Yes.
So I looked at these women who fled. I mean, for example, I had 18 women who fled when they were pregnant, 18. And the owners were very careful to point out that they were pregnant, and 9 of them, according to their owners, were in the 3rd trimester of pregnancy when they fled. One woman actually fled all the way to Indiana. Not only was she pregnant, but she had a child with her. And the owner said, I know she's gone to Indiana because when she fled a few years ago, that's where she went, but she came back on her own accord. So, I say from the outset that running away was difficult, but it was far more difficult for a woman, because if a woman was seen off the plantation, it was automatically assumed that she was a runaway because they were not supposed to be off the plantation. They were home bodies. They were supposed to be at home. They're supposed to be doing what it is that women do according to 18th, 19th century ideas about the role of women. And so it was far more difficult for them. And so, I had about 500 females who fled. And when you look at the fact that 2/3 of them fled alone, they were by themselves, and they're not running away at 1 o'clock in the day, not running away at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. They're running away at midnight, by themselves for the most part. And they're not trying to get north.
Dark
trying to
water
find
moccasins and copperheads and mosquitoes and bears and God knows what.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I think about it every time I ride between here in Elizabeth City.
Yeah.
Oh, I know.
It's dark out there now. Imagine what it was like 190, 200 years ago. Imagine.
Yes.
And people want to be free so badly, not trying to get to the north, but to find individuals from whom they had been separated.
Yes.
It's family. It's family. This year, Black History Month was the Black family. That was the theme for this year. And so it was all about family, not trying to make it north, as we have been told. Only 7% of those 3,000 individuals were headed west. Only 7% were headed north.
Wow.
93% were going to places in North Carolina. And the question I always ask, 400 of them were going to Virginia. Why would you go to Virginia? It's a slave state.
Yeah.
You go in there because you were born there, you were brought to North Carolina, you're trying to get back there, or you've been married to somebody for 15 years and she was stripped from you and sold to somebody in Virginia, or a child was stripped from you at 12 years of age and sold to somebody in South Carolina. So what do? You're looking for that loved one.
Yeah, and students need to know that for so many reasons. We all need to acknowledge that for so many reasons. One, because it kind of complicates the narrative, it enriches the story, it humanizes this kind of institution. But also you have to start to think about the resistance, the bravery, the courage, the spirit it would have to take to do that. Again, I think of Harriet Jacobs, who stayed in a tiny little closet for 7 years before she escaped Washington. The strength mentally, physically that you have to do that, and to teach about this history in a way that we're not just teaching students about, cropped ears and beatings. Yes, we acknowledge that because it's part of the hard history, but we have to elevate those stories of the fact that folks fought back. I think kids especially, they don't want to hear stories of people just rolling over and taking it, right? And that wasn't the case. And so I think what you're talking about is so important in that regard. Joanna, did you want to add anything on that concept of gender in terms of foodways, otherwise, in terms of slavery and gender?
Yeah, absolutely. So just speaking to foodways, it's a little bit complicated. So on the one hand, for the enslaved, food was not as gendered a thing as it was for wealthy slave owners, or for society in general, even a century or two later. And part of that was just because of the physicality of the kind of work that went into food production. So would women more often be the ones doing, perhaps making the final product? Maybe. but men would be so involved in the farming, in the slaughter, in the butchering. And there were certain tasks that were coded as male and certain ones that were coded as female. For the enslaved, this was even turned up, I think, because especially in situations where meals were being done communally, the folks who were assigned to cook were usually not picked because they were the ones who loved it the most or were the best at it. It was the people who, for one reason or another, were not able to be doing hard labor. So often that would include older men and women, or, you know, folks who happen to be sick of either gender. But what I will say is that when we think about the kind of chefs who were really running operations at plantations, and who were known among other slaveholders for their talents, who were really coveted, cooking could be a bit of a bargaining chip. Some enslaved cooks were able to work out deals with their slaveholders where they could sell leftovers and earn money, for example, or where they could rent out their services on a day that they weren't working. From what I have seen, the male chefs were able to take this and run with it in a way that women were not. So I mentioned those two kind of celebrity chefs. One of them, Hercules Posey, was enslaved by George Washington, and another, James Hemming, was enslaved by Thomas Jefferson. And both of these men were able in many ways to functionally live as though they were simply employed by their slaveholders. They would travel abroad. They were given passes to just travel freely around cities. I have not heard that kind of thing about women who were enslaved, even if they were equally talented in the kitchen. And so I think this is an area where we're seeing women being doubly oppressed, both by enslavement in the first place, but then also by certain rigid gender norms that leave them